I'm Magdalena Wojcieszak, unpronounceable Polish last name, yet now I'm based at UC Davis and also have one leg at the University of Warsaw, where I lead a very large grant. So today's talk will be very dense, so bear with me. I will be going through some of the things pretty quickly, just to throw as much information and studies and arguments at you as possible, because I'm really excited to have you as the audiences. So as Michael mentioned, for many, many years, observers have feared that our current media environment facilitates exposure to like-minded information, hyper-partisan news, to so-called fake news, and so forth. And this, in turn, has been feared to lead to polarization, extremism, beliefs in misinformation, and many other threats that American democracy and many democracies around the globe are facing. So accordingly, many scholars have studied partisan news, misinformation, and radicalization. And as Michael mentioned, for many years, including starting in my PhD, which I did at Penn, my work has addressed those issues as well. So I studied partisan media, polarization, online extremism, radical online groups. My first PhD project was on neo-Nazis online, so that was a fun thing. And I also studied misinformation. But in recent years, and here we have many people from computer science, the focus has shifted to social media platforms as additional culprit for the many ills of democracy. And platforms place users, as we all know, in those unique environments that are characterized by curated information flows that are then filtered through people's social networks online and then further reinforced by algorithms. And algorithms from these three, which is personal preferences, network structures, and algorithms are the least well understood factor that profoundly shapes information and content exposure online. And we know that they are designed solely to optimize user engagement on platforms. And they do so by mostly recommending content that aligns with users' inferred interests based on past on-platform behaviors and exposures. And in this context, most people, scholars, observers, journalists, politicians, focus on what I call loosely ideological bias in algorithms, which is the fact that for some users, platform algorithms recommend content that is politically congenial, that can be, extreme or radical or conspiratorial and misinformative. This has been kind of the dominant fear of many scholars and observers. And in this context, YouTube is receiving increasing scrutiny. It is the most popular platform on globally, and 70% of its content is said to be recommended by the algorithm. There are concerns that YouTube's algorithm directs users to conspiratorial or extreme content. Hence, YouTube has been termed the most radicalizing instrument of the past century. It's accused of putting people in filter bubbles and radical rabbit holes and so forth. And I will now very quickly present a study that first authored by my PhD student who is in computer science, and we aimed to, at scale, isolate the impact of YouTube's algorithm on platform recommendations. And we conducted a systematic audit using trained sock puppets. So just very quickly, we trained about 100,000 sock puppets by having them watch a total of about 10 million videos from across the political spectrum, some from very right to very left. So we trained sock puppets in those 5 ideological groups, being very right, center left, and very left. Again, I can talk about that later, about the details, but we then looked at what videos those sock puppets were being recommended. And we looked at recommendations on users' homepage, right? When you open the platform, and also these up next recommendations that are on a sidebar. We also developed a pipeline to estimate the ideology of each video, the ideological slant, essentially by analyzing audiences for each video in our data on Twitter. So this is no longer possible unless you pay $5,000 to Elon Musk for access to Twitter's API. Back then, it was possible. So just very briefly, what do we find? And again, kind of here we are looking at those, so to speak, ideological biases. And yes, we do find that videos on the homepage are largely congenial with those sock puppets ideology. So, for example, for the very left sock puppets, we see that about 77% of their recommended videos were either left or very left. This was especially the case for very right sock puppets, so you see here on the right. And for them, over 80% of recommended videos on YouTube's homepage were either right or very right. We also find that the very right users are recommended even more congenial content, kind of deeper in their watch trail, so a depth of about 20. So after following 20 recommendations, those recommendations to congenial, which again for right users would be right and very right videos, further increase. We also find that recommendations deeper in the watch trail, so again, the longer you follow these recommendations, are even more extreme. So the slant, the average slant of all the recommended videos is even more congenial, and it's statistically significant, but it's very trivial. So again, we can look at that a little bit in detail later, but yes, there were slight increases in congeniality or kind of in extremity of those recommendations, but substantively very small. And we also find, we looked at exposure to or recommendations to radical, conspiratorial, extreme, or otherwise problematic channels from previously used lists. And we find that, again, those recommendations to those very extreme channels are small, but they do increase deeper in the trail, right? So the longer our sock puppets were engaging with YouTube, the more recommendations they were receiving to conspiratorial problematic channels. And in total, over 36% of our sock puppets encountered recommendations to these problematic channels. Again, I'm happy to talk about the details more later. This is just to kind of set the stage of what is thought about when we think of those, or what I think about those ideological biases. So similarly to past work, this study that I just mentioned did find some evidence, right, for this ideological bias, that yes, those very partisan sock puppets are being recommended congenial content. Yes, those recommendations to congenial content increase for far-right users. And yes, we are seeing recommendations to problematic YouTube channels. But, and this is my first observation and argument, I believe that the focus, this dominant focus on radicalization, filter bubbles online, echo chambers, is very, very, very narrow and way too narrow. And in my view, it actually overshadows other dangers of our current communication environment, which are, in my view at least, much more fundamental. So we know that recent research shows that among actual users, and not partisan sock puppets, exposure to problematic content is very limited, very online. Very few people encountered rabbit holes of radicalization. Very few people inhabit echo chambers. Very few people consume misinformative conspiratorial content. And those very few people are consequential, right? Don't get me wrong. They are very important democratically for civil society. But depending on various estimates, different studies, they represent anywhere between 0.1% and 5% of the American population, right? Again, small numbers can be powerful, but nevertheless, focusing only on those, again, rabbit holes and echo chambers and filter bubbles is pretty narrow. So in my view, and this is my kind of second argument, the vastly overlooked problem is what I call, for lack of better term, if you have a suggestion, please tell me, is what I call interest bias in recommender system, and the consequent low level of consumption of quality news among most users and the population. So essentially, there are two levels of content selection that play into algorithmic recommendations as well. Right? The first one is what I term interest-based, right? You select sources and content based on your interests. If you're interested in sports, you watch sports. If you're interested in cooking and that's your passion, you watch cooking shows, cooking channels, and follow, cooking influencers, right? And only after some people select news or political content, they can exercise, so to speak, the second level of selection, of selectivity, which is political or partisan or ideological, selecting content that aligns with what they believe, right? And by definition, right, people who only follow the Kardashians cannot be put in rabbit holes of radicalization. Echo chambers do not pertain to people who are watching cooking shows all day, right? So again, most of public observers, most scholars, most journalists and pundits focus on the second level of content selection, right? People going to what agrees with them and therefore being recommended more congenial content. But, right, a sizable proportion of the American population is not at all interested in politics. Many people, according to many studies, see news as too complex, too boring, too negative. They are averse to partisan politics and they simply avoid news and politics. Again, we're here at one of the best universities in the world, right? To many of us, this may be, oh, really? Is that the case? But yes, there is growing research that finds that most people are politically disengaged. So for instance, across mobile and desktop, news comprises 4.2% of total online consumption, right? Not much. I will have even more depressing estimates very soon, right? And more people consume news on TV than online, which to many of us, especially the younger people, may be surprising. But even there, news is overshadowed by entertainment fare, right? Which is the dominant choice for most people. And in my large grant, ERC, which I directed at the University of Amsterdam, I collected online behavioral data from about 7,000 people in 3 countries. So United States, the Netherlands, and Poland. And large samples in those 3 countries took online surveys 3 months apart and shared with us everything that they did online for those 9 months. So we had people's browsing history spanning 9 months. And to get those browsing data, we used Web Historian, which is an open source tool developed by my collaborator. And here are the screenshots. It's great. It accesses people's browser history that's already stored on their computers and displays it to them using all those interactive visualizations, and then allows them to share the browsing data with researchers. So we had about 120 million visits, and we matched the visited domains, so the URLs that people visited over 9 months, to identifiable news domains from a list we curated of over 5,000 news domains in the United States. We also identified visits to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter accounts of those news domains on our lists, and also assigned them as quote-unquote news exposure. And we also developed multilingual classifier to determine whether the content that people accessed was about politics or not. Again, I'm really happy to talk about it later, but we have many studies to go through still. So what do we find? We find here that news exposure comprised an average of 3.4% of everything that those large samples did online over 9 months. We see some variations by country. Surprise, surprise, news exposure was lowest in the United States, the highest in the Netherlands, but still it's pretty low. Furthermore, right, we used our political classifier. We find that the majority, solid majority of the visits to news domains are not even about politics. People were accessing Fox News or CNN to check sports, weather, or cooking recipes on New York Times. So political exposure on news websites was less than 1% of, again, all the browsing activity that people did. So 96.6% of what people did online was not related to news. And also the majority of the news visits were not even to content about politics. Yeah.
Just to ask sort of the normative question here a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
The implication here is that this is very low. So what is not low? Like if we think about 4%, so people are awake. I was Googling it. It's like 16 hours a day or something. So It's like if I spend 4% of my time talking politics, that's over a half hour each day talking politics. Which I wouldn't. Yeah, it's like it's in an ex.
Yeah. I have that. If we can keep that for the end, that would be wonderful. Because I have that on one of my last slides. So yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So anyway, this paper here, which is from the data that I now presented, offers a bit more nuance, also engages with these questions as to what is the normatively desirable benchmark. I will get back to that. Right? But one could also say that people consume news and political content on platforms, right? And we didn't account for that, apart from explicit clicks on, YouTube page of, CNN. But, right, platform reports show that on platforms, news is even more limited than what I now show. So on TikTok, a report from last year, news comprises 1% of content. On Facebook, 1.4%, which is down from about 4% a few years ago. Right, on Twitter, a paper that I published a few years ago on a representative sample of Twitter use of 1.5 million Twitter users in the US, we find that the solid majority does not follow any politicians, any news media organizations, any pundits or news outlets, right? And also a report from Pew Research Center that just came out not that long ago finds that a majority of TikTok users follow no public figures as well, right? So this is not good. And in social science, many people for centuries or decades have argued that low levels of news exposure can lead to low levels of knowledge among the population, voting misaligned with individual and group interests, greater susceptibility to populism, hyperpartisan rhetoric, misinformation, and so forth. And we also know, based on research, that news exposure leads to citizens who are better informed, who have more stable attitudes, who are able to distinguish between fake and credible information, who have greater support for democratic norms, higher political tolerance, and so forth. So needless to say, there is a lot of benefit in encouraging users to look at news, especially that those low levels of news consumption among the population are further reinforced by platform algorithms. So here what I now am transitioning to is, again, what I call this interest bias in recommender systems that further redirects users from news and public affairs information. So again, because platforms are designed to keep users engaged, they keep recommending the content that they infer from your behaviors and other signals you like. So if you go online to watch sports or cooking shows, you will be continually recommended sports and cooking shows and effectively shielded away from news and public affairs. So, this is indeed found by a recent audit of YouTube that's poignantly titled Entertainment Traps on YouTube. That finds that even those who are politically interested and go to platforms for news, or to YouTube in this case, are redirected from news toward entertainment by the algorithm. Okay, so my recent work has been focusing on incentivizing greater exposure and greater consumption, greater recommendations and greater consumption to verified news and public affairs on social media platforms. So I will present two interventions which aimed at this goal. So the first was a field experiment on Twitter, when Twitter was still Twitter, and now this kind of work is no longer possible on the platform, where we aimed to engage users with news through their non-political interests. So I will talk about it in a second, what I mean by that. But here, Mitt, Liz, and Jacob, those are two of our many bots. Many of them got banned along the way. The project, I know, it was, we were 4 weeks in the field, but the entire project took over 1 year to prepare and to launch. It was really painful. But of course, also to not engage people with news that may be misinformative or clickbaity, we used external metrics to select 45 news organizations that are rated by external experts as rather centrist and as being high on credibility and factuality. So kind of those, good news organizations. So what we did, as I mentioned, we wanted to engage users with news through their non-political interests. What does that mean? We selected 3 topics. It was sports, entertainment, and lifestyle. And we came up with systematic keywords using word embeddings and then kind of manual additions that represented those 3 non-political interests. So different kinds of sports, different themes. For entertainment, we had shows, movies, series, and so forth. For lifestyle, we had, keto diet, we had yoga, and these kinds of keywords. And then we identified users who tweeted at least twice per week one of our keywords. Right? So that was also a pretty long-lasting user selection. We then eliminated bots, eliminated users who weren't tweeting in English, among some other filterings, which you have here. And we ended up with a sample of about 28,000 Twitter users who were, again, frequent Twitters, so to speak, about those non-political topics. Make sense? And then we assigned those users to our intervention. So users were either assigned to a control, nothing happened to their experience, or to a female bot intervention or a male bot intervention, which essentially meant that every time, or for a cap of up to once per day, a user tweeted one of our keywords, our bots engaged with that user in real time and contextually. So here you see, and we used GPT-2. It was quite a long time ago for those contextual responses. But you see, there is a user tweeting about sports, and here is then our bot responding to the user, relating the response to the content, right, talking about sports, but then essentially saying, get the latest sports news, but clicking here, right, and following up. So here, we directed users to topical sections of those verified news organizations and recommended following, again, a handle of that news organization on Twitter, right? So we had in those responses an hard-coded element that directed users to those quality news. And that lasted for about 4 weeks.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Did it reply every time they posted about sports, or
Up to once per day, to not spam.
and was it the same
users.
account, or were they getting from different accounts?
From different accounts, but systematically within either male or female.
And would they route to the same domains or randomly?
No, that was randomly.
Okay, so from their perspective, they're like just talking, and then like once a day they're being like, "Why are people keep like LA Times and like over?"
Yes, yeah, that was the case. Yes, yeah. We can talk about kind of the responses that bots were receiving, but yes, that essentially what happened. Yes. And then we, after those 4 weeks, we scraped the Twitter activity of all the users. We also had scraped their Twitter activity before the experiment to see whether they started following more news accounts relative to what they were following before, right? That's like what we explicitly told them to do. Whether they started retweeting from news accounts, whether they tweeted more about politics. Again, we had our classifier, and whether they liked more political content than prior. So what do we find? We find few small, those are the actually treated users, few small but statistically significant effects. So we do find that the treated users actually did follow more news accounts after our intervention and being bothered by those bots up to once a day, and they liked more news content, especially those in the female bot condition. So that's encouraging, very small effects, but nevertheless they are there. But
what is that scale? Like what is 0.05 what?
So this is the change in post-treatment behavior relative to pre-treatment.
Is it like 5%? Is that what I interpret that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. More than pre-treatment.
Okay.
Yes. But with one exception, these effects were sadly confined to those users who were already somehow interested in politics before, as indicated by the number of political tweets they had on their timeline before, right? So it's mostly kind of this reinforcement of the users who were interested in politics already engaging with yet more news after our intervention. So, this is kind of suggestive and not suggestive evidence that still being bothered by those bots in our case and encouraged to click on news actually can lead to this outcome amongst some users. And then again, the platforms work in the way that if you engage with news or like news or follow more news accounts on platforms, you will be recommended even more news over time, right? And then once you have those news in your online ecosystem, maybe you will follow, maybe you will read them and engage with them even more. So here we can't test this over time, reinforcing loop, so to speak, but perhaps some of those effects actually did generate even greater exposure and engagement with those verified news down the road. And in the second study, we promote exposure to quality news on YouTube. And in this study, we also wanted to disentangle two interrelated factors that I hinted at that can be responsible for low levels of news consumption. So the first is the user themselves, right? As I mentioned, most people are not interested in news. They see politics as boring and as irrelevant. So in this case, if we nudge people, the users themselves, reminding them that, news is actually useful in some way, that should encourage them to consume more news, right? So here we tested a user nudge, and we also tested a nudge to the algorithm. Essentially, can nudging the algorithm itself increase recommendations to news and subsequent news consumption? So we developed a browser extension for YouTube, only for desktop, sadly. And that extension, you can access it still on the Chrome store. That expansion had built-in interventions. In the user nudge condition, as you see, people who installed our extension saw a pretty naturalistic looking banner with piloted prompts that were altering throughout the day or throughout the week, reminding people of benefits, either personal or societal, of news consumption. So consuming news can help you better plan for your future, or news makes democracy stronger, and so forth, right? We had many previously piloted prompts that appeared on this banner. You can also see that there is a button that automatically took people to the news section of YouTube. And also there is this subtle, gray text in the search line as well that encourages people to watch more news, right? So this was our user nudge, reminding people of the benefits of news. I can't depict the algorithmic nudge because by definition it's kind of behind the scene. So in our algorithmic nudge condition, the extension automatically, every 10 minutes in the background, watched a video from one of our 45 high-quality news organizations, right? So essentially we're injecting news into people's browser history or YouTube watch history rather, to make the algorithm believe that the user is watching news, right? Because it's in their history. And to also minimize this ideological bias that I mentioned earlier, what we did, for every 4 videos that the user was recommended, 2 came from centrist outlets, 1 from left-leaning, 1 from a right-leaning outlet, right? To have this diversity. So we recruited over 2,000 frequent YouTube users from YouGov, which is one of the best panels or sample providers in the US. So those users installed our extension, were randomly assigned to either a control or our user nudge or our algorithmic nudge condition. For 1 week, nothing happened. The extension was establishing a baseline. It was unobtrusively collecting everything that those users did on YouTube. So all their watches, searches, clicks, and recommendations. And then after the first week, the intervention was activated. So again, in our user nudge condition, users were seeing the banner and so forth. In the algorithmic condition, the extension was injecting those news videos. After 2 weeks of this intervention, the intervention stopped, users completed a post-test survey, and then still kept the extension for 1 week to see whether there were any, so to speak, spillover effects of our intervention on users' recommendations and exposure. And again, I'm happy to to answer whatever questions you have later. What do we see here? We see that in the algorithmic nudge condition, right, recommendations to news, the green lines, increased once we started, injecting those news videos. And with them, consumption of news, the blue line, also increased during the 2 weeks of our intervention. We do see that it goes down after we stop the intervention, but it still doesn't go down to the baseline, right? So it still stays a little higher. So algorithmic intervention, so to speak, worked. We see absolutely nothing in the user nudge condition. Zero change. So reminding people that news is beneficial, that staying on top of what's happening can be good for them and good for democracy, didn't do anything. And of course, nothing in control as expected. Yeah?
Just to make sure I follow this. So the green line between the user nudge and the algorithmic nudge at the start of W1, like they're sort of similar, right?
Yeah.
So do you think there's some sort of like minimum temperature needed in order to see this effect? What's going on here?
Yeah.
Had to go from 10 recommended to 15 before you started seeing the effects?
Maybe, right? Like, yeah, it's back to the question about the threshold, because we see that it was at the watching of news before was, 3-4%, right? Recommendations were similar. And then when they increased, maybe there is a certain threshold. That's actually my big question also at the end to all of you about the threshold of what's needed, right, for this and also democratically. Yeah.
Can you explain, go back one slide on how the recommendation on after week 3 continued, but watch declined? Was that when the study ended? Like, what happened there?
So that's a great question. That's also something we've looked into it in big detail.
Yeah.
So yes, the intervention ended at week 3.
Okay.
Right? But it essentially this shows that these recommendations are kind of by default continuing on similar high level. Right, watching decreased. What we speculate is that was the Christmas and New Year's time. So maybe people, playing carols or whatever. I don't know, but we looked into this, yes, because this is odd. I agree, but we haven't found any explanation for it in the data apart from the speculation. It was the unfortunate time for this to happen. Or for this last week of the study to happen. But yes, we estimated more stringent models, kind of controlling for various covariates. Again, finding that those in the algorithmic nudge condition increased their consumption of news during the weeks of the treatment and also afterwards. Despite the decline, the effect was still significant. And in additional analyses, we did find this feedback loop. We looked at recommendations before exposure and then after, so kind of by very granular time slots. And we did find that recommendations drive exposure, which in turn drives the recommendations, and actually that the loop from recommendations to exposure was stronger in these statistical tests. So essentially, it seemed, at least during this intervention, that recommendations mattered more to what people consumed than what people consumed mattered to recommendations. Another important finding here was that people didn't decrease their time spent on platform. Right? Many platforms now say like, oh, people don't want to consume news, so let us downrank political content. Facebook did that several times over the past few years. Right? We found that people were still as active on platform. And then we tested whether our algorithmic nudge made the recommendations and news diets more politically diverse. So this is plotting the average ideological slant of news recommendations, the green, and watches before, during, and after our intervention by users from across the ideological spectrum. And we do see, and here especially for our conservative and very conservative users, that before the intervention, here the slant goes from very left to very right. We see that our very conservative users had congenial recommendations, again, the green, but even more congenial watches, right? So from those right-leaning recommendations, they were selecting those that were very congenial to what they already believe. What we also see during the intervention, this significantly decreased, right? Our intervention, which again recommended news from across the political spectrum, diversified not only the recommendations, right? The green, but also people's watches, right? You see the mean decreased here. It went back up, so went back to the right after the intervention ended, but still people's news diets a week after the intervention were more diverse than they were before. So in short, we not only not only encouraged people to consume more news on YouTube during that time, but also diversified their exposures. So I am working on a couple of other ideas that relate to this topic. So in this paper, which is forthcoming in Nature Human Behavior with my former student, we incentivized WhatsApp users and Instagram users to follow news accounts on those two platforms over time. We had kind of very cool compliance check. We had people submit screenshots that they actually did that. The reviewers really liked that. And we did find that people actually didn't know that following news on these two platforms is as easy and free. They actually really enjoyed it. We had some open-ended questions asking them about the experience. And that intervention had many positive effects. People increased knowledge. They better recognized misinformation. And amongst some other good outcomes. Also with my student and a small team, we are finalists of what's called a pro-social ranking challenge, which is by the Center for Human Compatible AI. And that center looks at working on more pro-social ranking systems. So our intervention was deployed amongst 7,000 users of X and Reddit and Facebook. And again, it was app ranking personally relevant news. So we are now in the process of data analysis, but that's also kind of another direction, so to speak, which is again up ranking on actual feeds. And then also I was awarded a second ERC grant. It's a very large consolidator grant that I'm directing in Warsaw. So I'm looking for postdoc and students, just FYI. And that grant aims to build cross-platform and also in comparative way extensions for platforms that can promote more verified, factual, diverse public affairs information. But then also I recognize that there are other harms to users on platforms, right? It's not only misinformation or lack of news exposure in general. People are exposed to hate and harassment. People are exposed to explicitly violent content, explicitly sexual content, amongst other clickbaity content and so forth. So also with my multidisciplinary lab at UC Davis, we are now using AI or LLMs more specifically and multimodal LLMs to identify different categories of online harm and also to dynamically re-rank content to down-rank harmful content on platforms and up-rank the non-harmful content. And doing that without kind of requiring extensive labeled data. So I acknowledge that some people do inhabit echo chambers, that some people are put in those rabbit holes of radicalization. And we need to attend to those issues as well, because again, those few people can be very consequential, right? And I have done it as part of different studies. As Michael also mentioned, this very large meta collaboration that look at the effects of Facebook and Instagram on platforms. But overall, I believe that the important problem is not that people consume bad political content online. This more important problem is that most people consume no political content. So given, right, all the entertainment, Kardashians, cooking, sports, and whatnot, right, this democratic broccoli, which is verified, democratically good broccoli, which is the verified factual news or public affairs information, are a tiny fraction of people's online diets. So again, most people clearly prefer, pepperoni pizza. So platforms are criticized for recommending congenial and radical content. And again, to some people, it does happen, and it can be minimized using various interventions. But again, in my view, it's pressing to minimize this interest-based selectivity and interest-based platform biases so that users encounter more verified and factual political content that can make them more resilient to misinformation, to populism, and to other democratic threats. And encountering more political content can also pull those more moderate voices back into the democratic process and minimize the impact of those very hyper-partisan, loud voices on the political arena. So in my view, as social scientists, as computer scientists, we really need to expand our focus beyond those, hot and sexy echo chambers and filter bubbles to other fundamental challenges in our information environment. And actually to look for solutions, kind of scalable and actionable, that could direct people to better information online. And there are many questions, and one of them, and I'm so sorry I didn't get to it at the beginning, I wanted to kind of pose them also to you, right? There are many questions that are challenges to this line of work because, right, what is good public affairs information, right? Who is to determine that? More importantly, to your question as well, what's the threshold right? After which we have good and informed citizens, right? Is 3% sufficient? Do we want, 40%? That's unrealistic, right? To me, the 3% seems somehow heuristically really low, right? But yes, maybe that is sufficient to keep people minimally informed, right? But also, right, is news good? Even the good news, right? It is very conflictual. It covers misinformation a lot, thereby exposing people to misinformation. It is very negative, lowering people's well-being and making people more anxious, especially many of us now maybe turning away from news for that reason. Right? People can also ask, and what about user autonomy, right? You're injecting videos to people's watch history, but what if people only want to watch cooking shows and sports, right? Is that then not an impingement on somehow their freedoms, right? Like, my daughters want to eat chocolate cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but, they don't, fortunately, but, it doesn't mean that I would give it to them, right? So I feel that there are some nuances there. Right, and then also platforms are unlikely to implement any of those interventions, especially now where many are actually moving away from content moderation and many are further decreasing or down-ranking political content. Right, other big questions, to many of those problems are described. There are structural solutions, right? It's about education. It's about inequality in America. Those are the more structural reasons for some of the challenges, right? And kind of changing recommender systems. It's a tiny drop in an ocean of other reasons for what's happening. So those are some big questions that I don't have answers to. So I'm hoping you can help a bit. But yeah, I hope that was, again, very dense, but I hope it was maybe provocative and interesting. So I'm really looking forward to your questions, to hopefully some responses to my questions. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for comments, questions, feedback, problem solutions.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, yes.
Did you consider the comments at all on the YouTube videos and stuff? Because I feel like a lot of times I'll watch a video, but then I'll go down to the comments and try to get a consensus.
Mm-hmm. We didn't. Not in those studies. We have a project now looking at whether people are discussing politics under non-political YouTube videos. So that kind of focus. But meantime, as part of that, I've read many YouTube comments, and there are many disturbing ones. So it's kind of many people focus on, Facebook or other platforms, but content moderation in YouTube's comments is almost non-existent, I would say, based on what I've seen and read. So yes, that's very important. Yeah.
In the first study that you talked about with YouTube, you were looking at watch trails.
Yeah.
Were those trails just within a particular user session that you were seeing those effects? Or
Yes.
was it, over a longer period of time?
No, it was sock puppets, right? So those users were automated and they were clicking on the up next recommendations up to 20 times. Our trails were up to depth 20. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a curiosity, in some of the surveys that you mentioned, did you ask the users if they actually watch news on television?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And they do it.
So people report that they do, but also kind of in social science and in political science and communication, there's so much research showing that self-reports of news exposure are very unreliable. So on one of the slides, I mentioned that 40% of TikTok users say that they go to TikTok for news, right? That's not the case as platform data reports show. So, Yes, so people say they watch news, not as much as they used to, and varies by demographics and so forth, but many people do not. And there are also international surveys by Reuters Institute that explicitly ask people about avoiding news, reasons for avoiding news. And they find that over 50% of people globally, they say that they do avoid news now, right? So some people say they consume, but many also admit they avoid.
You mentioned that data is unreliable. That people say that they go to platforms like TikTok for news, but then the platform data shows that isn't the case. How do you reconcile that with people's different definitions of what news is? Like,
Yes.
They're probably not talking about news as in specific news sites and official platforms, but also other people talking about it, which might not get picked up by that.
Yes.
Data.
Yes, and that's a great question, and that's also one of my questions to you, right? A lot of focus in general, and in this work as well, has been on more institutional definition of news, because news institutions, news organizations have actual reporting standards, fact-checking standards, so we can know that what they are showing is verifiable, or some of them, yes, thank you for that. But it's also the case that many people see, influencers as news sources, and many influencers or celebrities are posting about politics, right? So I haven't considered that here, but in some other work where we looked at civic content altogether, right? So anything, whoever posts that's classified as civic or political, it's still incredibly low, right? And it lacks those journalistic verification standards. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess for me, some of the themes that I'm concerned about in the broader internet is that a lot of these things that will be genuinely beneficial for people to have access to by news sources and stuff like that. A lot of times this research has been painted as censorship, and I think I've also seen a lot of opt-out of by people wholesale of platforms just because they feel like there's some aspect of there's a censorship of something, and then they just reject.
Yeah.
I guess I want to understand in this field, how do you kind of counter sentiments like that, or kind of I guess what do you think about the impacts, those kinds of impacts?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question, because we saw different concerns about different kinds of censorship, right? When after January 6th and deplatforming, many more conservative users left Twitter, left Facebook, and went to very niche and unmoderated platforms, which probably wasn't very good, because then they were in those echo chambers by themselves that were not moderated. Right, currently, or after Elon Musk took over Twitter, right, many people who are more on the liberal side are leaving Twitter and have left for that reason, right? So yes, there are many different external factors that lead people to join or leave certain platforms, but in general also those kinds of interventions or attempting to somehow tweak or guide people's exposure, they are also can be criticized as censorship or attacks on individual freedom. If people again want Kardashians, let them watch Kardashians and not give them news. So I think there is a very difficult normative balance as to how to best address it. And again, I don't really have all those answers. But for instance, in Europe, where I'm from, regulation is much more favorably seen than it is in the United States, where many people value mostly the freedom of speech. So, there are more actually EU-level regulations aimed at platforms and content moderation. So I feel it's also very context dependent. Mm-hmm.
One last question.
Please, thank you. It's more of I have to go to that class after this, so it's more of a future research question I wonder we could test. It's clear that we're doing digital nudges, algorithmic nudges. what I do in my social media is I remove search history, so I don't get this algorithm.
Yes, yes.
Is there a way to track someone who's just searching on their own isn't recommended content? You give the people in the study give permission to be like, you can look at my history, but I don't want the algorithm dictating what I see.
Yeah.
And if you could do a physical nudge in the real world, a person or a talk or whatever, and see what they search on their own, how that, like, I'm trying to see like what the statistical graph would look like in terms of influence and political exposure.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something that could be tested? If so, why not?
I think so, right? I think the easiest way to test it would be using sock puppets again, right? And some sock puppets would just not have any training data, no training history, right? And then let's see what happens. Some have different. So now we are testing recommendations to sock puppets with different proportions of harmful content in their watch history. To also maybe get at your question kind of about this threshold under which things are noticeable. So some sock puppets have 0% of harmful content based on our other classification and taxonomy, some 5, some 10, right? And we're looking at what happens. We haven't incorporated the other external, right? Because of course, all this is interconnected, right? You search on Google for something and then Facebook recommends that to you, right? So this also looking at those cross-platform fertilization, so to speak, will be very interesting. But yeah, so we are not doing that yet. But of course, accounting for these cross-platform algorithmic influences is very important. Yeah.
All right, let's thank our speaker.